Thank you, Madam President. I'm actually on the floor to speak to a different issue, even though I think expediting votes is an important one, and I support that. But I'm really here to highlight the negative consequences for our country of continuing to fund our government through continuing resolutions. One of the most basic constitutional duties of Congress is the appropriations process. The nation relies on this body to provide federal funds for programs that support national defense, small businesses, our border defenses, conservation of public lands, food assistance for low-income families, and so much, much more. And as a long-serving member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, I am extremely disappointed that Congress is about to pass yet another CR that's going to take us to March 11th, nearly 5 months past the start of the fiscal year. Now, on a positive note, I understand that there is a tentative agreement on top-line funding, so that we should have budget numbers for an omnibus that would fund the remainder of the fiscal year. And that's good news. But the fundamental problem remains. Long-term CRs create uncertainty and inefficiencies inside and outside of the federal government. CRs prevent agencies from issuing new grants or expanding programs. They curtail hiring and recruitment. And moreover, those who rely on government programs and federal resources, and that could be either SNAP recipients or defense contractors. But everyone is forced into a budgetary limbo. And simply put, when Congress refuses to act, people can't do their jobs. And this is especially true for our military men and women who are serving. From Russia's efforts to undermine democracies in Europe, to China's rapidly expanding sphere of influence, to the unpredictable threat of rogue actors like North Korea and Iran, the threats we face today are varied and numerous, and nothing hinders our national security more than funding our national priorities in piecemeal fashion. You know, make no mistake, as we're engaged in this crisis right now in Europe, where Russia is on the borders of Ukraine, threatening to invade, we can bet that Vladimir Putin is watching our Congress to see if we can actually get an agreement to get a budget funded for the rest of this year. Recently, several of my colleagues from the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense and the Armed Services Committee met with Marine Corps Commandant General Berger to discuss the challenges that are facing the Marines. The message from General Berger was clear. If we continue to fund our government through CRs, it will erode our military readiness, it will cut training time and impede the maintenance processes we rely on to keep our soldiers safe. The impact of continued CRs on our military would be wide-ranging, and the negative effects would continue to ripple for years. And we have this experience since I've been here, when in 2012 and 2013, when we had the budget cliff, we saw what happened to our military. We saw readiness of our men and women in uniform erode. Thousands of pilot flight hours would be lost. Critical exercises with international allies would be canceled. Our overall global presence diminished at a time in which our adversaries are seeking to outcompete us in multiple theaters. Aircraft, like the brand new KC-46 tankers that we're so proud to have stationed at Pease Air National Guard Base in New Hampshire. They are such a point of pride. They're an invaluable strategic national asset, but they'd spend more time on the ground rather than flying the missions that they were designed for. And submarines, the backbone of our nuclear deterrence and technological overmatch against our adversaries, and, by the way, the ships that China is most concerned about. They're an instantly recognizable symbol of American military might and the values of our country. They would be sidelined due to maintenance disruptions. That would have significant impact not just for our readiness, but also for places like the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, which has as its responsibility the maintenance and repair of our attack submarines. So what kind of a signal does it send to adversaries like Russia as they continue amassing troops on the Ukrainian border and threaten the stability of Europe when we can't get a budget? Long-term efforts to recruit and retain the best and brightest to serve in our military would be undone as bonus and incentive pays are cut and overall in-strength numbers decrease by thousands. Military families would be forced to bear the burden of greater financial uncertainty on top of the many sacrifices that they already make for our country. We would be left with a smaller, less capable force that is demoralized from pay cuts and forced to shoulder greater risks for their safety. Now, in addition to the harm to our service members and military families, we'd also be undermining the critical modernization efforts that we need to keep pace at a time when competitors like China are experiencing technological breakthroughs. Just 8 months ago, I'm sure we all remember that China tested an advanced hypersonic missile that was launched into space before re-entering the atmosphere and nearly hitting its target. This test should serve as a wake-up call about the urgent threat that China's military breakthroughs pose. And if the United States research and development efforts are slowed down due to the constraints of operating under a continuing resolution, we will not be able to drive the innovation needed to keep pace with China, let alone regain a convincing advantage. And make no mistake, Putin isn't the only one watching to see if we can get a budget agreement in this Congress. Xi is also watching from China. The development of our next generation fighter to ensure we will maintain air superiority in the air will be slowed. Our efforts to defend against cyber attacks that could cripple critical infrastructure or expose national security secrets would be hamstrung. Simply put, for all the might and selfless service of our servicemen and women, we would be asking them to defend us while tying their hands behind their backs, simply because we in Congress can't find the courage of compromise. I would say to my colleague, Senator Cornyn from Texas, who talked about the narrow focus of Democrats who are in the majority in this body right now, a very slim majority, worrying only about our own parochial interests, that this is an opportunity for us to work together. Let's work across the aisle and see if we can't find some agreement on budget that will get this done, not just for the remaining months of this fiscal year, but next year and the next year and the next year. Because China doesn't just compete with us on military technology. China and our other economic competitors are pouring resources into scientific and technological innovation. And if we want to sustain our global prosperity, global leadership, and national security, we cannot afford to be caught flat-footed. That's why last week the House of Representatives passed the America Competes Act, which is a companion to the Senate-passed U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which passed the Senate months ago with a very strong bipartisan vote. These bills will soon be in conference, and if passed, they will bolster innovation and international trade. But the investments to meet the authorizations that are contained in these bills can't be made under a continuing resolution. I chair the Commerce, Justice, and Science and Related Agencies Appropriations Subcommittee, the CJS Subcommittee. Our bipartisan CJS bill included a $1 billion increase for the National Science Foundation to keep pace with scientific discoveries that can power the economy in fields like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, microelectronics, and advanced communications. Under a CR, we would forfeit the chance to fund 2,300 additional research and education grants that will support 27,500 more scientists, technicians, teachers, and students compared to fiscal year 2021. That means a lot of innovative research projects, and therefore potentially new discoveries, technology, and industries would never get started. It also would diminish our ability to train the next generation of innovators. And it isn't just at the National Science Foundation. Under a CR, NASA wouldn't have the needed increases that will help us return humans to the moon, the high ground that China is also eyeing. We'll lose out on the opportunity to provide the Department of Commerce additional funding to build next-generation climate and weather satellites that will help small and medium-sized manufacturers enforce export and trade laws, and that would invest in economic development. Furthermore, a CR would delay implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Last year, along with 9 of our colleagues, we drafted the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is bipartisan legislation to make historic investments in our nation's infrastructure. The legislation provides $550 billion in new federal investment to respond to the needs of the country, from rebuilding crumbling roads and bridges to providing clean drinking water, addressing harmful contaminants, to expanding broadband coverage to even the most rural parts of our country. The Senate passed that infrastructure bill by an overwhelmingly bipartisan vote of 69 to 30. And when President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act into law, it became the single biggest infrastructure investment in U.S. history. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to invest in this country. But if we continue with CRs, the implementation of this bipartisan infrastructure law could be delayed. In addition, as a result of its flat obligation limitations, a CR would prevent state departments of transportation from accessing higher amounts of formula funding provided by the Highway Trust Fund. The CR would also prohibit new starts for new formula programs authorized by the bipartisan infrastructure law, including the FY 2022 portion of the carbon reduction program that supports emission-reducing transportation projects, and the PROTECT formula to fund states to support transportation infrastructure resiliency. Now, in addition to slowing meaningful infrastructure investments, a CR also fails to address urgent needs in our communities. Americans want to be safe from international threats to our national and economic security. But more important, they want to be safe in their communities. Yet in 2020, murders rose by 30%. The Senate Commerce, Justice, and Science Subcommittee bill includes significant funding to help local police departments fight crime and put officers on the street. It also includes a new community violence intervention initiative to implement strategies to reduce homicides and gun violence. But in a CR, we wouldn't have funding for this promising strategy. We would also lose the chance to provide historic levels of funding for the Office of Violence Against Women. And today, it's particularly important because a bipartisan group of senators will introduce a reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. But without a CJS appropriations bill, we can't provide additional funding for the Sexual Assault Services Program, which is a formula grant released to states, tribes, and other coalitions, in order to provide support services like medical services, counseling, crisis intervention for victims of sexual assault. And we cannot start new programs like restorative justice, a growing area in criminal justice, to repair and address the harm experienced by victims. Madam President, continuing to rely on last year's funding levels and last year's programs undermines our chances to improve our military readiness, to invest in our economy, and to address emerging challenges. This week, instead of enacting funding bills for the fiscal year that began on October 1st, 2021, Congress will instead extend the deadline again, passing another CR through March 11th. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad we're continuing to keep the government open. And I understand that Senate leadership, Chairman Leahy, Vice Chairman Shelby, along with their House counterparts, have reached a tentative agreement on total spending levels to allow us to use the next month to finish our work and enact a remaining year appropriations bill. But it is way past time to have made that happen. The American people deserve no less, and we need to do better next year. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.